to the number of scholarly articles on existential risks or human extinction, and as you can see, the dung beetle wins out easily. We narrow the search then to dung beetle and reproduction, so only looking at scholarly papers looking at dung beetles making whoopee, and that also beats out attempts to secure our own survival. But although the importance of avoiding existential risk is kind of obvious, it's interesting to ask just how bad would an existential catastrophe be? And one way to make this question more precise is by comparing these three different scenarios. So scenario 1 is disaster is avoided. Scenario 2 is there is a disaster which kills 99% of the world population, but not everybody. And scenario 3 is some disaster happens that kills everybody. So intuitively it's clear that A is better than B, which is better than C, but just how big is the difference between these? So one view is that the difference in badness between A and B is about 99 times larger than the difference between B and C. If you just look at the number of people killed, the difference between A and B would be over 6 billion people difference. 6 billion, 580 billion people difference. Whereas the difference between B and C would only be 1% of the world population. So some much smaller number. Another view is that the difference between A and B is much smaller than the difference between B and C in terms of their badness. And this is because although B would kill a lot of people, C would prevent future generations from coming into existence. So depending on the value you place on there being future generations, you will get very, very different results as to how bad an existential catastrophe would be. So suppose we go with this view just to elaborate what it implies. The other view, which focuses on the value of bringing future possible generations into existence. Just how bad human extinction is on that view depends then on how many people there would be in the future. It's one of the things it depends on. This is the UN's prediction. If you look at the larger scale, we see that population figures have increased dramatically. Now, if you really think seriously about this and think about how many people there could be if humanity survives, the critical next couple of centuries or so, and presumably we could colonize the universe, etc., then we don't really find the answer by extrapolating these past population graphs, but we can think more from first principles about how many people the attainable resources would be able to sustain if used by a civilization that had very effective technology. So here is one way of calculating it up. If you assume that the future people would be simulated and using only the resources in our supercluster of galaxies, you'll get a very enormous number of people that could be sustained. And the upshot of this is that for every century that the colonization of the local supercluster is delayed, the potential for having 10 to the power of 38 human lives is lost. Human lives of normal length, so the equivalent of 10 to the power of 38 people living, say, for 100 years. This might be off with a few orders of magnitude. This is a very rough estimate, but it gives you a ballpark sense for it. This is equivalent of 10 to the power of 31 potential human lives per second. If we do a more conservative estimate that doesn't assume non-biological instantiation of potential persons, then we get a smaller number, but still one that is mind-bogglingly huge. The potential for 100 trillion potential human beings is lost for every second of postponement of the colonization of the local supercluster. Again, if you want to be more conservative, you could remove a couple of orders of magnitude, but it gives you a sense for the enormous numbers here. So one might think that just looking at that number, that the obvious thing to do would be to rush as quickly as possible, because if every second we lose that many potential lives, then we shouldn't wait even a second. We should get there, and the sooner the better. But in fact, the conclusion is different. the lifespan of galaxies is measured in billions of years. The timescale of realistic delays that we might choose to make is, we might hold back for years or decades. And so if you do this calculation, you find that it's much more important to reduce risk than it is to avoid a very small delay, small in the cosmic sense of small in relation to a timescale of billions of years. Even a single percentage point of reduction of existential risks would be worth a delay of over 10 million years from this utilitarian perspective. So all of this presupposes this view that you count the value of possible future beings that could come into existence equally as the objective to avoid the deaths of existing people. So for utilitarians who hold that view of value, then what they should do can be boiled down to this practical heuristic, which is, I call it the maxi-POC rule. Maximize the probability of an okay outcome, where an okay outcome is any outcome that avoids existential disaster. Now, you might not hold this theory of value, you might have some other ethic, or you might not be altruistic at all, or you might be only partially altruistic. There are many, many combinations, and these would have different implications for how important existential risks are. One thing you might consider doing, if you do have uncertainty about what the true moral philosophy is, or if you're only partially altruistic, is to think of a kind of mental budget. Suppose that you're only assigning a 1% probability to this kind of utilitarianism being the correct normative theory, or that you're only, say, 1% altruistic. Then you might think you would spend 1% of your time and resources figuring out the most effective ways to reduce existential risks, and then you could do other things with the rest of your time. But it might be better to set aside a specific budget for this purpose, rather than to do acts that seem sort of vaguely good from all these different viewpoints. You might get more bang for your buck by thinking in terms of budget. Now, in fact, the badness could be even worse, because so far we have just assumed that there would be all these future human lives that could be lost. But transhumanists, at least, have a vision that life could be much better than it is today. If we think of a large space of possible modes of being, ways of living, feeling, thinking, and relating, then the ones that are currently accessible to us humans is a tiny little crumb of this much larger space of possibilities. A subset of the space of modes of beings accessible to animals, since we are animals, which is in turn a small fraction of the space of possible modes of beings that we can conceive and imagine, which in turn presumably is a small part of the larger space of possible modes of beings that are actually there. I mean, we can't concretely imagine what it would be like to be a Jupiter-sized brain, but out there in this larger space, there is that sort of theoretical possibility. And presumably some of these are very good. The opportunity cost is even larger than just counting the number of lives, which suggests, of course, all these calculations presupposes that these hypothetical future lives would be good ones that would be worth living. And it's an interesting question if you think it's more likely than not that they would be not worth living, in which case kind of the imperative turns upside down. So let's look a little bit more specifically here at what we're talking about. We can define an existential risk as one that threatens the terminal and massive failure to achieve humanity's cumulative axiological potential. So I'm introducing a little bit of terminology here, which I think is helpful in the end to think about these topics. Where axiological potential is the potential for instantiation of value. If value is relative, then it would be human value. If it's not relative, then just value simpliciter. Capability potential is another term that we will use, is the potential for developing technological, organizational, economic, or anthropological human capacities that make it possible for values to be realized. So we can think of axiological potential as placing an upper ceiling on how good things could be, capability potential at any given time, placing some ceiling below that, and the actual outcome would be some level below